So, like I said, today is ethics in public speaking. Probably could have been talked about a little earlier in the semester, but better late than never. All right. So today we already did attendance. We're going to talk about what ethics actually is. I'm sure y'all are kind of familiar, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Some guidelines for ethical speaking, as always. We're going to talk about plagiarism. There's 3 different types of plagiarism, so we'll make you aware of all 3 of them. Ethical listening. How can you be an ethical listener? Maintain eye contact. You ever talk to somebody and they're just like always looking at their phone? It's kind of hard to talk to that person. And then we have the ethics quiz. I saw that I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 of you had already done it. It's only 10 questions. It's on Canvas, but that's the last assignment that you have besides the homework for this chapter and then the persuasive speaking assignment. That's all that's really left. Then we'll talk about next class, which we don't have class next week because the majority of you are going to be on your high school spring break. So the week after that, we'll have persuasive speech workshops, 2 days. So what is ethics? It's dealing with issues of right and wrong, basically the morality of things. And this is a very gray area because you could think of things in terms of the spectrum, like right is over here, wrong's over here. What's sort of in the middle here, But it deals with issues of human affairs, human rights, that sort of thing. But don't confuse it with legality. That's my takeaway for you is, the law isn't the same as ethics, even though they're sort of intertwined, You can't really be thinking of them as being the same thing because just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. You know what I mean? Like you shouldn't drink until you're 21. There's not an ethical point of view for that. Like you could make an ethical argument to say like, oh, well, it can damage your brain development, so morally speaking, it's wrong. But that's not really in terms of, ethics. So we all have to make ethical decisions every day, We have to say, is this okay? Is this not okay? Did I do the right thing? Did I not do the right thing? But they're all based on a certain ethical code or standard, that's pre-existing to us. So what are some guidelines? Number 1, have ethically sound goals. What are you trying to accomplish in terms of, I want to persuade you? Are you doing that in a way that's ethical? You're not trying to scare people or fearmonger people. In my group therapy session on Tuesday, it was all about loneliness, and there's a 20-year-old girl in the group and she was like, I live with an alcoholic father and a narcissistic mother, so I can't really escape the situation. What do I do to feel less lonely? And I was trying to be like, the longer you stay, the worse it's going to get. You might become an alcoholic, you might become a narcissist, but I was trying to be ethical and say like, I'm not trying to scare you and say, you are going to become these things, right? That's not what I'm saying. It'd be unethical to be like, do it or this will happen. Kind of saying like either this happens or this happens, which is a fallacy of argument. So be ethical. Don't use scaremongering. Have you ever seen or heard the term victim imagery? Anybody? So you'll see it a lot with like PETA, where they'll put like, severed heads of animals or something like that to be like, hey, don't eat animals. You know what I mean? Victim imagery is like, look at the victims and feel bad because of these images, You also see it with people who are pro-lifers. They'll have like the little tiny hands on baseballs, which are all doctored, you know what I mean? But yeah, you want to be ethical when you're trying to persuade people. Don't just scare people. Don't just make it seem like, you're a monster because you're not doing X, Y, or Z. Be prepared when you're wanting to accomplish some ethical speaking. Be prepared for road bumps, and be honest. That's probably the most important thing to take away from all of this is, you don't want to mislead people. That's not the goal of public speaking. Excuse me, because you've done the research. It's up to you, excuse me again, to convey the information in a way that's not misleading. Don't do any name calling or abusive language. That's kind of a given, but that's not ethical in and of itself. And then put principles into practice. Like if we want to give up caffeine, try putting that principle into practice, as an ethical point of view. Name calling, we all know what name calling is. No defaming, no demeaning, no degrading, either individuals or groups. Plagiarism. You give ideas and aren't your own. Pretty simple. You're saying, I came up with this when that's not true. You didn't come up with it at all. What are the 3 types of plagiarism? There's global, patchwork, and incremental. Let's start with global plagiarism. You steal from a single source and you pass it off as your own. That's like the most basic way you can, say what is plagiarism. But then there's patchwork, where you're not necessarily taking off of one source. You could be taking from 2 or 3 and then passing it off as your own to say, I came up with this. That's like giving your speech and then not giving any source accreditation to where you found that information. You're basically just pulling it out of your butt, to put it in bluntest terms. And the incremental, you just don't get credit for parts borrowed from other sources. I found this information here, but you don't tell the audience this is where you got your information. That's incremental. So the internet, we all know that anybody can put anything on the internet. So we have to kind of be wary of what we see. All you really need to know is that you need to cite sources. Again, I've said this before a million times, but until you say where information come from, you're basically making it up, is, what's essentially this slide is saying. And then take careful notes because, you find one piece of information on the internet that might be saying one thing, but then you get to another source and it's saying a completely different thing. And you have to sort of gauge, okay, what's the right answer here, All right, ethical listening. Speech making is a two-way street, obviously. I'm up here and I'm not just talking to an empty room, There's people here, I have to be aware of, how are people listening to what I am saying. But you have an ethical obligation when you're a listener too, because if you hear something that you're not necessarily a fan of, you can't just tune it out, right? Because that's not an ethical way to listen to somebody. You have to sort of, gauge your own way of thinking with theirs and sort of be more open-minded. You can't just turn your brain off and be like, all right, well, I don't like this person and what they're saying, so I'm not going to just listen to them. That's not ethical. You got to hear people out. Unless they are being an unethical speaker, then you sort of have, more leeway to not listen to them. All right. Ethics quiz, module 13, 10 questions. Already, some of you have already probably done it, but that's all I got. Like I said, it's not a very long lecture. It's just, don't plagiarize. That's basically it in a nutshell. So April 16th is our next day in class. It's a persuasive speech workshop. So since it's only 9:46, this lecture took me like 10 minutes, You can sit in here and work on your persuasive speech. You can go out there on a computer and work on your persuasive speech, whatever. But this time is yours to do whatever you want with it. So